Well, I'd been in the Philippines almost 2 years, and I had yet to really go on an extensive sailing trip. But the time was getting to where I wanted to go, and so I headed north with my girlfriend Jen to the city of Dumaguete, where there's a college, a university called Silliman University. And there I was to meet three other people, and we were going to embark across the Cebu Strait to the island of Bohol. And the purpose of this, I'll get into that in a little bit. But the trip was quite nice, and normally the winds are against you going north, but this time it was quite light. So when we got to the beach, we picked up the people and the supplies and loaded everybody, and we headed across the strait to Bohol. Now, the person in charge of this, his name is Kent Carpenter. He's a very accomplished ichthyologist. I'd actually met Kent about 35 years previously when I worked at the American Museum of Natural History in the fish department, also known as the ichthyology department. Ken is quite a famous ichthyologist. He actually has two fish named after him, which is quite an honor. But he also spent a lot of time in the Peace Corps in the Philippines and has very good connections there. You also see in this picture his research assistant Abner, and Abner has a master's in fishery science, and he's a very helpful person because he was the liaison between the fishermen and Kent. So he was able to negotiate and to explain to the fishermen which species and specimens we would need. I'll get into the reasons for this trip, but essentially it was to duplicate a voyage that was made by a very famous research vessel in 1908 to 1910. And the reason for this is to look at the effects of overfishing in the Philippines, because they've had a lot of problems with overfishing there. Now, here's a picture of the vessel. It's called the RV Albatross. This was the first marine research vessel ever commissioned in the world, and it was 234 feet long. It was mainly a steamboat, but it also had the ability to sail. And so it made many, many famous expeditions around the world and collected specimens from a lot of different places. But as I said, it visited the Philippines for about 3 years, and the specimens from that expedition are being kept in museums, so they're accessible. They're actually preserved in rum, which is a type of ethanol. Now, the good thing about ethanol is it preserves the DNA, and the purpose of this trip was to collect the same types of specimens in sufficient numbers that analysis and comparisons could be done to see if overfishing was actually occurring and how bad it was. Now, this is my vessel. It's a 36-foot boat. This is in Panama. This is actually the size of the seining boat on the Albatross. Quite small, but you know it's covered many miles while I've had it, and also previous to that. So there were 5 people on board, and so it was a little bit crowded, especially with the supplies and stuff, but we managed to set up some cover and tarps and things on the deck, and we did a little bit of it below also, but it proved to be acceptable and a pretty good working platform. So we embarked across the Cebu Strait, and here I am talking to Abner. The weather was, again, quite good actually for the whole trip. It was a 9-day trip, and we were heading for a small island off of Bohol called Panglao, and this was kind of just a stopover so that we could kind of catch our breath and get organized for the next leg of the voyage, which would be to the north. So, as I said, this trip was for the purpose of collecting specimens and particularly the flesh of these specimens were used to extract DNA and to compare it to the DNA of fish that were collected back in 1908. Because if you can compare the same snippets of the DNA and look for the amount of variation in those snippets, it gives an indication of the total population size then and now. So we got to Panglao. It was quite calm. We tied up to a mooring. It was actually quite a strong current, but it was good to just relax and kind of talk about what we were going to be doing the next day, which was going to involve a fairly long trip to the north. And so here we are, coming into the next place, which is called Pandanon Island. And this was also visited by the Albatross, and it's primarily a fishing town, so a fishing island. Essentially everybody that's there is a fisherman. Here you see Panglao from the distance, and then getting a little bit closer, you can see all the shacks on the island. Now, as I said, this has been a fishing island for many, many years, and it's also a center for dynamite fishing, which is a really kind of a terrible, destructive process that is used to fish. Basically, people they make explosives, and then they detonate them underwater, and they blow up the reef and kill a few fish, and it's very dangerous for the people that do it, and it's also devastating for the coral. So again, the purpose of this trip, the whole study, was to investigate the effects of overfishing on particular species of fish. So when we got there, there were bancas. These are the vessels that the Filipinos use. They have floats on either side of them, and they would come right up to the boat. And Abner made it known which fish species that we wanted and the approximate numbers that we needed. And it was really amazing. They would come right up to the boat, and after Abner showed them the pictures of the species, they generally brought the exact types of fish that we needed. And of course they would be paid quite well, actually. So they were pretty eager to show up with the fish. Now here you see us on the foredeck of my boat, and you get the fish. And for instance, this is not a target species, but it's quite interesting. It's a mothfish. Now the fish were prepared. These are species of barracuda. We didn't take the whole fish. We actually just kept the tails of them because they were really just to extract the DNA. Once the species was identified, their tails were cut off and they were preserved in a sort of a buffer type of alcohol, and so it wasn't as bulky as if you were to collect the whole fish. The upside was that you would get quite a bit of fish that were edible, and these fish, these barracuda in this case, the front part of it were cooked by the Filipino girls on board, and it was quite a tasty meal. And so we had plenty of fish to eat, and the species we actually ended up getting all of the species that they collected on the original 1908 trip, which was pretty satisfactory. So, as I said, the fish were used to look at variation in the DNA, because the more variation within a species' DNA, the larger its population size can be extrapolated to be. So if there's little variation, that means that the overall population size is probably decreased since the original samples were taken. So here you see the fish being sorted. There were many different fish. This is actually not a target species, but it's a sharp-nosed puffer fish. Here's an assortment of fish, including the mothfish. There are some, actually these are some squid. This is a dragonet, a very pretty, and of course the girls played with it a little bit, sort of stuck it onto a pole. This is a filefish, again not a target species, but these are the ones that we were looking for. They're a yellowtail barracuda. And so, the fish would come in, the fishermen would be paid, then the sorting would begin, and we put up a tarp to keep the sun off, of course, and tried to do it as quickly and efficiently as possible. Couldn't take too much alcohol, so we were trying to make sure that the samples were well preserved. Here's Kent sorting the fish out. Here you see an example of the Nalgene bottles that are used to place the tails in, and also the igloos, which kept them from getting too hot, the igloo cooler. And so you see Kent sitting in a chair. That chair actually broke not long after that. It had been around for a couple of years, and it just finally bit the dust. But this was the daily regimen, was getting the fish early in the morning, usually around 8 o'clock, and then have all the processing done essentially by breakfast. They use these visors, which have magnifying glasses in them, to look for the small details that allow the identification of fish, such as things as spines, numbers of spines, and various types of characters are used to distinguish between them. Here's a barracuda that had just eaten another fish, so and at the end of the day we usually had some beers. Sometimes we had Tanduay rum. As I said, in 1908 they didn't have pure alcohol, but they used rum, which contains ethanol. And fortunately this doesn't denature the DNA. It doesn't destroy the DNA. So it's really helpful, because the old specimens that are now in museums can be taken out and have DNA extracted from them. So that's where you get the idea about the genetic time machine. You're looking at kind of a window into the past and using it to extrapolate about what has happened to the fisheries in the Philippines. And so every night, as the sun would go down, people were still fishing, and sometimes you would hear the sound of dynamite blasts, and they had various means of catching the fish. Sometimes they speared them, sometimes they used nets. But as I said, we had plenty of fish to eat. These ones, the fishermen just sold them to us for pan fish.
Hindi na kalihok. Wala na nag-ambak. Ano ko? Hindi akong patayin. Ambak na lang. Hoy, luya po na ni Patson.
Okay, so that was our breakfast one morning. And then another place we went to, the fishermen came up and had a whole bunch of crabs. And so we purchased some of these crabs, and the girls cooked it up. It was really nice the way they cooked it. And so we had crab for breakfast. And another thing that they did was to make this type of dried fish called boulade. They dry it in the sun and then fry it in a type of oil. I didn't care for it that much, but here's Abner talking to the locals. This is me and Abner. We walked around Pandanon one day, and it was very nice. It was a big sand spit. And also, we went to the locals and showed them the illustrations, and also looked at some of the vendors, some of the people selling fish, to see if they had the species that were needed. But pretty soon, I think we spent about 5 days there, we had to go to the next spot. And again, the weather was very nice initially, but it kind of deteriorated, so we weren't able to go to the exact spot. But fortunately, we found a place in the mangroves where some fishermen were available, and one of them was very good in terms of collecting fish, and he ended up getting us the last species that was needed. This is obviously one of the rainbows. And the last place we went to is the biggest city in Bohol, called Tagbilaran City. Here's Jen and I going back to our home. And so thanks for watching, and please subscribe.